Bonjour, bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon. Hello to everyone. Welcome to this first panel discussion that is the starting point of the Country Risk Conference for 2022. And on behalf of BFM Business, we're very happy to be partners of this very beautiful event. So we will have three panel discussions. We'll be talking about this huge phenomenon of a transition towards more sustainable development models. We'll talk about the global economic perspectives with experts of COFAS and their assessment of the risks on the global economic recovery. Yet divergence, this is the key word of our first discussion for today, and this divergence, which is a growing one, a worrying one between developed and emerging countries.
Le directeur général de COFAS.
Bonjour.
Bienvenue. Tania Sologou, bonjour.
Welcome. Tania Sologou, you're economist and in charge of emerging countries and geopolitics at Crédit Agricole. We will need the vision of an industry. Pascal Minot, you are the general manager of Bouygues Construction, and Thomas Goma, you are the director of the French Institute for International Relations. Xavier Durand, the general manager of COFAS. You have a lot to say about what is in store for us for 2022. There are many topics that we could have talked about: supply chain, inflation, geopolitical tensions, and I'm forgetting many. We chose to highlight in presenting your perspectives for this year this notion of divergence. Why so?
Je crois que cette notion de divergence.
Well, I think this notion of divergence or the stop of convergence involves a great many phenomena, and you've mentioned quite a few. Since the 90s, there has been a prevailing school of thought whereby there's gradual convergence of emerging economies towards mature economies, illustrated by the fact that per capita income in emerging countries was about 12% that of mature markets in 2000, and it's rose to 22% in 2018 or 2019. And since the crisis broke out, we have seen the stop of this convergence. It's come to a grinding halt. Now, of course, there's a recovery, and the advanced economies are back to pre-COVID levels, back to 2019 levels, whereas emerging economies are still 5% lower than pre-COVID levels, and low development, countries that are not developing fast are even lagging behind more than that. So there's a 2% lower employment rate in certain countries. If you take Brazil, Mexico, or South Africa, we're at 8% or more underneath the pre-COVID employment level. So we thought that it would be interesting to look at the causes and the consequences of the stop of the convergence, because there are a great many implications in terms of the economic environment, in terms of the social environment, the political environment, and as you know, our business consists in helping companies face up to market-related risks. And these are phenomena that help us consider all these risks.
We'll examine them in details. Xavier Durand, we agree that these divergences did not appear with the health crisis. They have been highlighted more.
Elles ont été révélées peut-être par.
Actually, they were revealed by the crisis, because from in 2017, 18, and 19, their volatility seemed under control. The economies had been growing at the same time, and now the crisis has highlighted latent, concealed tensions, which make the universe of the environment of the recovery more risky.
Tania
Sologou, when we talk about divergence under this general word, we are mentioning many things. How can this divergence appear? What is the typology of it?
Yes, and if I may go back to what you said, there is a key word here. It is about revealing. This is what the crisis is about. Your question was about what happens before. A lot of emerging countries entered the crisis with a growth that was slowed down, and with this, the feel that they were catching up, but slowly. This was linked to several elements: a lack of capital, a loss of capital productivity, and many countries, among those you mentioned, were trapped in the intermediate revenues. So, and there was also a slowdown for China. So what is interesting in this field, and thank you for asking the question, is the moving from this idea of a slowdown, catching up phase up until acceleration, that is to say, up until divergence. And that's the growth differential, which is the interesting statistics between emerging countries and developed countries that is shrinking on and on. But we have reached the lowest level these 25 years. And with this transition, thinking about it, I believe that there are cumulative events, both for poorest countries and for richest countries. For the poorest countries, and this is something that is definitely talked about, there are so many international reports. We see the scars of the crisis, especially on the job market in the field of education, and these sectors will roll out in the years to come. But it is also a matter for the richest countries. It is the gap that makes this dynamic of divergence quite interesting. And for the richest countries, the thing is, the crisis has made a certain phenomena possible, in terms of commodities, strategic resources, Taiwan, Korea producing semiconductors, and finance. Because just to keep it short, there is a report from Credit Suisse, which is really interesting about it, which said the more we insert cash into the economy, the more it shows on the financial markets and on the real estate market with increased inequalities. So you have poor countries that are getting poorer and rich countries that are getting poorer. It works also for people.
Thomas Gomard, beyond what has just been said, what are for you the characteristics and the causes of this diverging movement?
I rather take an interest in political divergences and its effects. What Xavier and Tania said, I mean, what I'm struck by is the differences between models. Maybe what matters actually is the time frame. I think you have to take into account, obviously, 9/11 in 2000, but in 2001, also China entered the WTO. And there is another crisis that came before the health crisis, is the 2025 plan announced by China a few years ago, which announced their protectionism, the 2030 Sustainable Development Plans, which aim at lifting many emerging countries from poverty. And there's also the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreements, which are supposed to really regulate the evolution of business models. So from all this, you have political confrontation as to what models will be followed. And this is stoked, if you will, fire is stoked by the health crisis. And it revealed, it's the proper word, it's a catalyst for everything that we've been observing so far. The health crisis is going to bring to the fore differences in managing the health crisis between, on the one hand, the Chinese model, which seems very efficient in terms of number of casualties, even though some of their figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt. So that model, and on the other hand, the US or European models, which seem to be a lot less efficient. The other factor which explains this divergence between emerging and developed markets, it's the recovery from the crisis, the vaccination rollout. When you take a look at the map of the rollout, it explains a lot why developed countries are bouncing back and why emerging markets are not, and because they don't have access to vaccines, and so they are somewhat making their way out of the globalization.
Mignot, when the industries is approaching this environment. So briefly, could you introduce Brief Construction?
Yes, Bouygues Construction is a company that is present in 60 countries in the world, 55,000 employees, 13 billion turnover, and business. We have 40% in France, 70% in Europe, 20% in Asia, and the more mature economies, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia as well, and roughly 15% in less developed countries, Caribbean, Africa, South America.
This movement of divergence, how did you feel it? What consequences can it have on your activities?
Now, maybe this divergence it's like what happened 2 years ago with the COVID crisis. There were same effects at the beginning. The closure of work sites, of projects, and then we had to start all this up again, and there were problems due to mobility, migration movements that were initiated with the closure of the work sites that had to be reversed. And this, for us, a company, when you stop a project, you have a lot of capacity immobilized. And there is difference in treatment in the more developed countries, where we have most of our activities, a number of measures that were deployed by the states to provide support when there are problems with penalties regarding default on deadlines, and also for public tender and public support to help. And this is something we saw in developed countries, Singapore, France, and most of the developed countries, supported by the state, sometimes also accompanied by private players. And this is something we didn't see so much in developing countries. And then another phenomenon that's more specific to our business is certain parts of our, or segments of our business, stopped very early on. Everything to do with transport and tourism, the construction of hotels in countries that are less developed, Asia and Caribbean countries. And our countries, for most of them, were suspended or halted. The building of airports, also another one of our businesses. Lots of projects were put on hold, and many of them haven't resumed yet. So an impact on these business lines. Another thing you may have observed in regards to the environment, there's been an acceleration of awareness regarding the environment, and construction was a major part of the problem, but also a major part of the solutions when it comes to carbon footprint. We have an acceleration of the awareness with many consequences on our business, which were major consequences in developing countries, majority in Europe. And this awareness wasn't experienced in the less developed countries the same way.
Thomas Gomard, we thus feel that this crisis also shed the light on the role of the governments, on public authorities. This divergence in what we have just heard, and it's very clear, has been mitigated in large proportions, or the impact of the crisis is again shedding light on what we can call the good governance.
Well, precisely. I mean, when you take a look at the role played by public states, by states and public authorities, it's a distinction between emerging economies and developed economies. Because when you are a developed economy, you don't turn to the WHO, you turn to your own authorities. However, when you're a state which doesn't have sufficient infrastructure, you turn towards the WHO. So I think, the relationship with public authorities has really been different from one country to another, from one region to another. And there's this trade-off between efficiency and constraints in a way. So that's one first observation. Second of all, what really strikes me with the health crisis and the way that it relates to what public authorities do, either there's been more cooperation or less, actually. For instance, in Europe, it was a patchy sort of rollout, but 2 years on, the EU, when actually it's not in the competences per se of the EU, the health management, the vaccine rollout management, the EU has weathered the storm rather well compared to what it first did. So it's probably less the case in the US, and it was a shocker, I mean, in the way that the US authority reacted, even if they improved afterwards. So it's also, I think, something that really reveals what we should and can accept in a health crisis, which heralds others, I think. I think in the background, what is becoming clearer and clearer to one and all is, on the one hand, we are becoming more and more aware of climate change, global warming, loss of biodiversity, pollution, and we're becoming more and more aware of this. And on top of this, there is this sort of, digitization of the world, more and more data every day. So And obviously, this is something that is truer for more advanced economies.
Et ça veut dire...
Xavier Durand, I can hear you talk a lot about the health crisis. I'm not an epidemiologist, but we may hope that the hardest part of the health crisis is behind us. What you are describing is going much beyond the health crisis, and this is what we can conclude from what we are saying now. These deep divergences will be durable.
Well, now, as we are moving away from the health crisis, no one knows whether it's over or not, and there may be more to come, as Thomas suggested. But anyway, there are reverberations that have been revealed by the crisis. What I'm saying is now we're setting up the remedies to face up to the post-COVID situation. Monetary policies are tightening, left, right, and center. Now there is residual inflation. Is it structural or not? That's debatable. But anyway, there's inflation that is picking up. There are supply chain disruptions that have different kinds of impacts on companies, industries, countries, and it's quite dramatic, actually. And there are decisions that will be made following the consequences of the crisis. Some strategic industries will be insured. Some people discovered that they could work anywhere, from anywhere. So there are quite a few consequences. And of course, this involves risks or changing environments. And whenever there's a change, there's a risk, right? Changes in the economic environment post-COVID. We mentioned the energy transition, which was somewhat overlooked during the crisis because we had other things to attend to, and there was less consumption. And now energy is more expensive, and hey, surprise, there's this new problem, soaring energy prices. So in terms of risk, which again is our business, we assess and appraise risk, and now in the post-COVID crisis, there are new risks. Maybe they're more acute, they're different, and anyway, they're quite different from one country to the next, because whether you're in a mature country with a robust economy and you control your currency, whether you're pegged to the dollar, whether you are a producer or importer of energy or commodities, whether your neighboring country drives your economy or not, well, there are differences between countries.
Tania Sologoub,
Well, if I may, before you ask a question,
I'm here to ask questions, yes.
Many things were said, and I wanted to respond to this, especially about this crisis being over or not. I think that we must acknowledge the fact that there will be two different worlds. One world, endemic world. And if you look at the levels of vaccination, so where people will be vaccinated with a lot of consequences on growth, on tourism, and then there are two different worlds, debt-wise, refunding means. Two worlds. I mean, I said that financial markets are gradually going back to the world that used to exist. On the one hand, we have emerging countries that have traditional solvency constraints, and we will see what is to happen in Brazil, Chile. Sanctions, zero tolerance about the tax reform. And on the other hand, countries that are developed, who are entitled to the debt button, to designing fiscal and political policies. But these are two different worlds.
So two risks environments.
It's also two kinds of risks. Yes, it is going to be complicated because we're using the same ratios for both these words. Secondly, and I'm just responding to what was said, I believe that we have an imperative, especially for less developed countries, would be growth anyway, because growth will be required to face and to cope with the debt. And secondly, to be able to jump into what will most matter in the 10 years to come, an investment cycle That's what you were referring to. They will not make it without investing properly on digital technologies and on climate. But this is also a matter of geopolitical pressures and incomes. But on this question of growth, and that would be my conclusion, about this notion of growth, the main problem is that emerging countries' economic policies, have no leeway. There's no leeway. We consider that there is a great complexity in terms of countries and Gulf countries, but many of them have no leeway anymore. Why? Lights are red everywhere: South Africa, Kazakhstan, Colombia. How can Latin American increase their tax bases with such precarious conditions for a big part of their population? That's internal and domestic policy matter. And also the investment rates that are increasing, and also financial markets themselves that have the same kind of sanctions without providing the capitals that are required. So there's an imperative in terms of growth, but the economic policy has very little leeway.
Pascal Mignot, you described earlier on how you're affected by the crisis and the differences between countries, situations, and each of your activities. What are the lessons we can draw from the crisis? Now that we are, for the health part, nearing a post-COVID situation, what has changed in the way you will be working, investing, and producing?
Now, perhaps when it comes to the choice of the countries where we're going to be present, and clearly, with a more expansionist policy, we realize that in a certain number of markets, we're well present, we've developed our business, there's a capacity for extra growth, and extra growth linked to the fact that it's linked to new needs, the way that buildings are built, low carbon construction, the design, circular economy. That's one first element. And then the infrastructures that these developed economies are asking for today, based on carbon-free mobility, renewable energies, which are major markets for us. And there's a specific know-how, high-tech know-how, there's perspectives for development in these developed countries that are much more certain compared to other activities that haven't started up again or not totally secured in developing countries and maybe with less stable funding.
So fewer risks for developing countries?
Well, 15% of our business does represent that, but we're going to really focus on these forms of contributions to low-carbon economies and also contributions to digital economy for infrastructures, for fiber optic networks and things like that.
What is really interesting is that we're starting to see this, and you're putting your finger on something that I find very worrisome, something key. Look at the latest report from UNCTAD. There is a growing concentration of new projects, what we call greenfield projects, in developed countries as well as in Asia. Conversely, there's a drop in those projects in Latin America and in Africa. And here again, I'm talking about trends. And this is a key aspect, which is being compounded by all that CSR business. So yeah, CSR is good, we're happy about it, we all keep track of what's happening in terms of green financing, but there's a correlation between CSR investment and per capita GDP. So this creates a concentration and also a divergence.
If this dichotomy keeps on worsening, if there is a widening gap for all the reasons mentioned, what is the geopolitical risks? What is the risk of tensions between some developed countries and developing countries?
Well, what I'm seeing is a risk of divergence between developed economies, between China and the US, typically. We have, this is the framework that we're working with.
Yeah, there's a real tension, but it's another topic.
It's not necessarily another topic. In terms of geopolitical risk, that's the main matrix, and then they will have domino effects on third areas, if you will.
Well, we're being explained that WIG is less encouraged to invest in some countries.
No, it's not as a consequence between between US and China, not necessarily, but these tensions result in systems of sanctions that make it difficult for companies to, for instance, the EU has 40 different regimes of sanctions ongoing at the moment. So as a company, you need to work with that, obviously. And I insist on the China-US dimension. Why? For two reasons, because 40% of CO2 emissions come from either US or China. So if they don't work together in a proactive manner, the Paris Agreement will be very difficult to, will be completely out of it, So everything will be down to this rivalry between both blocs. And you have more than $1 trillion of military spending between US and China. So this is what I'm talking about, the essential matrix there. Now, when we look at other areas, other regions, what we're seeing blatantly is that there is, regional powers are on the rise. For instance, Turkey. Turkey is in dire conditions in terms of its economy, but it's from a geopolitical standpoint, it's expanding. Russia, likewise, it has difficult relationships with its neighbors, such as the Ukraine, even though the macroeconomics of it are different for Russia than it is for Turkey. Then you have the third category of risks, the risks that come from failed states. These difficulties that we've been talking about, meaning that state powers, state authorities are crumbling upon themselves. Take a look at Ethiopia, for instance. Ethiopia, which not that long ago was heralded as one of the great successes of emergence, and now they are grappling with civil conflict, civil war.
Xavier Durand, this post-COVID crisis will reveal some weaknesses. Okay, they feel better, they have a more efficient health policy, a more robust management of the crisis, they have the tools and the resources, but they also have increased their debts. They started protection mechanisms for companies that are not here forever. So we are coming back to normality. So even in developed countries that manage to sail the storms, maybe things will degrade.
Well, unquestionably, risks are on the rise. But there is a twofold situation. Indeed, more has been spent, but we have more ways to control our budget. And in the 2007 crisis, the states were hesitant to intervene because the origin of the crisis was finance. So there was something moral at stake. Now, the crisis is the result of a virus. Who's going to blame the virus, right? And intervention is not a problem. And intervention is less costly than non-intervention. But risks are on the rise. Debts are rising. But we can control debt. And the conclusion that I can draw from all this is that we are experiencing and will experience a highly complex situation. And it is very difficult to forecast what will unfold. And as I see it, that is what matters most in all this.
Without anticipating the next panel discussion, whose topic will be transition. But there's a connection between the two. This transition towards sustainable development model is fundamental. So in any case, this widening divergence will increase the pace of transition of divergence as well. So it is a phenomenon that will self-feed, really. And without supported countries will have more difficulties getting out of the crisis, managing the transition, and be more diverging.
Clearly, we're already seeing the geopolitical effects of environmental transition. If you're in the Netherlands, it's going to be difficult, but it's going to be even more difficult if you're in Sri Lanka. So there's the question of climate justice, which will come to the fore. Many developing countries are telling developed countries, first of all, you are not, keeping your word under the Paris Agreement. and you are developing at the detriment of our common good, which is the climate. So this will breed very difficult geopolitical tensions. And there's a fundamental difference in how we see things. For instance, Europe sees this as a problem of governance. And in China and the US, they see it very differently. I think these two countries are basically organizing their digital and environment policy depending on their geopolitical strategy. So their main aim is to take over the other as the main power. So, and if they need to use environmental and digital policies to do that, well, be that as it may, So, and I think this will bring on a systemic crises that will be closer and closer together, and this will lead us to looking for closer cooperation.
Do you agree to say that this divergence and transition phenomenon are closely linked?
Yes, I agree. One caveat, however. Well, I'm not saying that I disagree. I just have a caveat, because we're going to get it wrong. The question is where are we going to get it wrong? Because yes, this world is full of uncertainty. There are lots of breakthrough, a lot of disruptions, and also we're moving into something historic. We're finding increased pressure, increased tension in all countries, even the least developed countries. It's difficult for countries to think of themselves as being empowered, as being more autonomous. What do I mean by that? Geopolitics has an impact on fault lines. Yes, but obviously when you drop a pebble in the water, this sends a ripple effect. And those countries that needed to become more empowered and regain agency in every area of the economy need to set up action plans over the long term. That's what I find concerning. So what do I mean by seeing oneself as more empowered, more independent? Maybe I'm being optimistic, too optimistic relative to reality. But if we look at most countries, ready-made solutions. We're happy the Washington Consensus is finally dead, yay. But what I'm saying is that countries have a more pragmatic approach to development. It's mostly bottom-up. It's based on local experience, and this will please our French Nobel Prize winner for economics. So look at what's happening in India and how economists there think. They're thinking about the value of a community, and that is a very interesting thought. So we have a negative approach. We think negatively or positively certain things, but they have a different point of view. And there's so much in literature on what is a market, what is value, etc. So there's something happening. We're seeing tremors. However, now getting back to what Thomas was saying earlier, there are countries such as Russia that started diverging from the back in 2015, even earlier. So their trajectory started to diverge from a geopolitical point of view. In other words, geopolitics took precedence over the economy. What does it mean? They started hoarding, accumulating reserves. They have very low levels of debt, and they are obsessed with stability and autonomy. And there are other countries that are doing the same. Turkey, for example. Gulf countries, very soon Azerbaijan as well. So they're obsessed with being empowered, independent, economically in particular, even if this means hurting growth, hurting revenue, even if this means a sclerotic political system. So the main source of uncertainty for the future is China, because what is China is doing is putting on the table its own growth priorities, and China is making huge and important choices, and their system creates inequalities, and we should all pay attention to that. I know there's a fashionable narrative about that at the moment, but China is also self-segregating. So what is going to be the effect of that on other developing countries? That's very important. There may be a strong divergence by China, de facto.
Donc on voit bien que cette divergence, elle est à la
So
fois
we can
complexe
clearly
et
see that it is a
différente.
complex and multifaceted divergence. Pascal Mignot, how is this influencing your development and your investment strategy? One of the notions that Tanya was mentioning is that of the long term. Is it more complex, more difficult? Not for all your activities, but for some of your activities. You surely have long-term projects over a decade. So is this... Well, the fact that it is so much complex, difficult to read, really, so that there are many possibilities of tensions. And for the longer projects, is it more difficult?
I'd make two comments regarding that. First, I was talking about these major infrastructure projects for renewable energies and digital technologies. And it's true, it's in developed countries where there's most demand, where there's more expectations on the part of societies in these countries, and because it's an environment that we see as being more secure. One of the consequences of the health crisis was the disruption of the raw material markets. The cost of materials, availability of materials, transport of raw materials, and the countries, the less secured in that regard, and those with less local production are the countries where the projects were impacted most. And what I note today in our projects in Europe or in the States or elsewhere, we tend to turn towards a more local supply chain than we would have done in the past, because we're hoping to avoid this phenomenon of disruption of logistics at a global level. Is it a fleeting thing, or is it something that's going to be more long-lasting? Another phenomenon we've observed relating to infrastructures that answers this aspiration to autonomy. A number of investments in infrastructures, in industry, in energy, and in health. This is being relocated country by country, and these are opportunities for business, and in the more developed countries where we're already very present.
Xavier
Durand, since the beginning of this conversation, we have been noticing divergences, multiplicity of topics. I would like to ask you questions about another type of divergence. I mean divergence inside countries. This type of divergence is widening. The discrepancies between revenues and incomes is increasing. They do generate, in countries like ours or similar countries that generate social tensions, how can this risk, well, is this risk existing, and how do you understand it?
Well, it does exist, and it came before the health crisis. The yellow jacket phenomenon in France is evidence is that it was interrupted during the crisis, of course. There were some political measures that dampened that, and a number of measures were implemented by countries that could afford to roll them out. But nevertheless, the risk does exist. And that social risk is something we measure as an integral part of the operating risk of any economic player. And we have a social risk index, which is on the rise. So the theme of divergence goes beyond gaps between countries. It has to do with social cohesion.
So this is developing everywhere on all continents?
Well, for the reasons mentioned in our conversation, the index is on the rise. For good reason, commodity-based economy, access to critical digital tools, for instance, education, the type of economy that you're in. Because if you spent the last 2 years in the tourist or restaurant business, well, it were tough times, right? More so than in other industries. So, again, the crisis has revealed latent factors, underlying phenomena. And this results in risks that take on several aspects for companies. And they vary from one country to the next and from one industry to the next. It also depends where you are in the value chain. And that's Coface business to determine all that. And that is the conclusion that I can draw. There has been an increase in the overarching risk, and uncertainty is greater and greater.
How can these internal tensions can be included in how you understand the political tensions? An example among others, it's quite clear that when it does exist in the US, we may consider that it is an advantage for the enemies of the US to see the Americans fighting on the Capitol. So Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping are not disappointed when seeing these images.
Well, a couple of things. When you take a look at the difference in life expectancy between Singapore and Sierra Leone, it's 30 years. And between the richest and poorest neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, it's also 30 years. So the inequalities within countries have been extremely deep. It explains a lot. You know, the Trump phenomenon, you know, polarization of societies. So much so that in the Biden administration, there was this idea that, you know, they wanted to invent foreign policy that is favorable to the middle class, you know, because they feel that the democratic identity of the U.S. was under threat. So, we've seen that Trump has been able to target certain segments, and in his bid for protectionism, but you know, the U.S. and the Chinese economy are so interlinked that it's, you know, it cannot go all the way in terms of protectionism. Then the Chinese much more so than the Russian for other reasons, but efficiency is on their side. And what they do basically is they lambast democratic regimes, saying that the U.S. is a mess, that 2024 is going to be chaos, the midterms are going to be an important indicator. What's going on in the UK? The political life, which presents a number of similarities with what is happening in the US, but also in France. I mean, we are seeing this sort of lurch to the right. So all this is being used by China, basically saying, you're part of history. Now it's our moment. And so it's the moment for our model. The main difference being that the Communist Party in Russia fell in 1991, but it's still present throughout China. It has 90 million members and millions of cadres, if you will.
Well, let's remember, you know, the level of inequality. Well, there are several ways to assess in terms of wages and revenues, but there is something quite striking. The level of inequality is pretty much the same in the US, in China, and in Russia. That's quite interesting indeed. It proves that the economic system has analyzed all economies, no matter the regime. So if you refer to China with the Common Prosperity Programs, it's something that must be observed. You know, the Chinese are very good on some elements. It's their capacity to assess urgencies. So they can make this diagnostic, and we can do it too. We have the same system to proceed. But my second comment is, we're talking about a transition and ending the political crisis. Well, you know, we've studied the transition in Eastern Europe, and we've talked about this term, you know, transition. And what can we learn from this past? Well, we're not ending this polarizing world, and I believe that the key word is trust. And this is a term that has been studied by economists, and there's a great author, Hirschman is his name. And what makes people move and evolve towards polarization is when they are disappointed. It's disappointment is the difference between words and reality. So ending the crisis is about rebuilding trust. And there are indicators that are quite interesting to consider, because we know that in societies, usually the level of distrust between individuals is correlated to the level of distrust towards states. So if we want to, it is a matter of rebuilding relationships between the individual and the states and individuals themselves. So you see there are reports proving that the number of people who died from COVID could also be partly correlated, if you compare Brazil with Singapore, with the level of trust people placed in their community. And I believe this is, to me, is a way to leave this dichotomy, legitimacy, and having trust in the state and the community.
On approche de la fin de cette conversation et je
We are nearing the end of this discussion. I would like to talk to the two company managers here. We looked at the macro aspects of the impact of divergences on how economies are organized, the geopolitical impact, how you tackle your respective markets. But now, I would like to know what this is changing for the company. I mean, for its structure. Does it mean that you will have fewer offices abroad, or you will think more before setting in a country? Will you modify the work organization? Would change the way you decide to settle in a country? What has been modified by these phenomena?
For us, for choice where we're going to grow and where we're going to be present, we think more about being present in developed countries more, and countries where Bouygues is already present, and to look for synergies and effects of scale or added value that we're going to be able to generate in these markets. Another way, in our way of working, we realized lots of things can be done remotely when we have an activity where you have projects that have been long-standing projects and projects that are projects that we export and follow a customer, and we do them differently. We might have fewer resources. For example, we may not send people to the States or Philippines or Singapore sometimes. So we found different ways of working with more local teams, smaller teams, and this made us open our eyes to a number of problems we had in terms of efficiency internally and models that we continued to repeat, and we realized that we could do things differently and better, and it's been very positive.
When risk is back, Xavier Durand, when it is more difficult to circulate people, really, and when you're a company that by definition aims at assessing the political and economic risks everywhere in the world, well, maybe you can say that we have too many offices here, we need fewer people in the field, and to continue with what Pascal Minault was saying, you need local people where we are not much present. So what are the consequences for your structure and the development of it in the next months?
Well, the tagline of COFAS is for trade. In other words, we have to work at both ends of the line. Our organization is international. We have operations in roughly 100 countries, and everything we've talked about shows how uncertain the times have become. There's movement, there's complexity. Therefore, it's more important than ever to be on the front, at the vanguard of these changes, to really wrap our arms around them in order to respond quickly. During the crisis, we discovered the power of technological facilities. In 24 hours' time, in March 2020, we moved to work from home for all our teams globally. people would have thought us crazy if we had thought it was possible, but it does work, and it's productive. The engagement of our employees has increased 24 points in the process, and cycle time, response time, has been improved. So the crisis has revealed the worth of these models, and we invest in these models more and more. We fortify our local presence as well as our global integration. And in the end, we are still working on the same path. We are more and more risk management experts with a decentralized approach. We do what companies find difficult to do, face up to this multitude of geographic aspects.
Merci. Merci beaucoup à tous d'avoir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. Thank you to our listeners, and stay with us for our two next panel discussions dedicated to transition towards a sustainable development model and what you are all expecting as each year the economic forecasts and the risk assessment of this country risk conference. Thank you very much.